Okay, here we are. What we're doing is, remember chapter 10 on mutations, viruses, and protein synthesis is extra credit. We're skipping over chapters 11 on how genes work and 12 biotechnology. To go on to, so you haven't got time for those because we have to tackle a really big, important topic, evolution. And so we'll jump into chapter 13. Now, I'll have to talk a little bit about mutations from the extra credit chapter. So I will reiterate some things from that chapter on mutations because that's like the working material for evolution. So we got to know something about mutations to understand evolution. Okay, so how populations evolve, why evolution matters. Life on Earth is gloriously diverse. That's part of the name of this course, the unity and diversity of living things. More than 1.3 million species have identified, and that several more million are awaiting discovery. Of course, most of those are going to be really small organisms, but there's still a lot of organisms that haven't been described. So, evolution allowed Earth to become populated with this abundance of diversity. The environment plays a powerful role in evolution. It really chooses the back to mutations, what mutations are beneficial and what ones are not. So a lot of people think evolution is like completely random. No, it's not. There's no way something as complicated as a living thing could have just arose by random processes. There are some random processes in evolution. We'll get to those. And mutations themselves are random. They're randomly generated, and where they're generated is random. But then they're selected by what's called natural selection. I'm going to define this a little bit later on. And this is really real, that's the real adaptive evolution. Okay. And there's the next, which means the next sentence. The organisms that are closest neighbors are those that are well adapted to a human-dominated environment. So we've sort of like dominated a major life form on Earth now, and we're changing the environment. And the most successful organisms on Earth are going to be the ones that really can live in our kind of environment. There are certain places on Earth we should leave completely wild, and shouldn't modify them. But we need a place to live, and we highly modify the places we live. So there are organisms like cultivated plants and flowers, and certainly deer. They have adapted real well to living in our environment, and they're very plentiful now because we killed off their predators, and you have almost no predators. The biggest predator for deer are automobiles, I think, which I just proved the other day when I hit one. Okay, human activities alter the environments of organisms in ways that result in rapid observable evolution. Evolutionary changes can be studied in settings affected by natural environmental changes. So you can think of this way, our selective breeding of our domestic plants and animals and the ones that we raise to eat, they've been changed in huge ways. That's really rapid observable evolution. But the natural evolution happens very, very slowly and is not really observable, and you have to infer it through the evidence that's available. And some people don't buy that. They don't think evolution is real, but most scientists do. Okay. So understanding evolution informs all biology, from exploring life's molecules to analyzing ecosystems. And the real power of evolution is really in its explanatory power. It explains the sometimes bizarre ways organisms are put together and how things work. It's really hard to see how how these strange things have been put together. And now applications of evolutionary biology are transforming medicine, agriculture, biotechnology, conservation, and biology. The theory of evolution has become the bedrock of modern biology, and it's a part of everything that we talk about and everything that's changing. It has its basis in evolution. So first we look at the diversity of life. And actually in the next chapter, we're going to do chapter 14 too. And that's going to be a little thing on the diversity of life as well. So people love to name things, classify stuff, right? Name, describe, and classify the inhabitants of the natural world. So we're going to get into taxonomy here. And we've already talked a little bit about taxonomy because we've already talked about early in the semester, we talked about the kingdoms, all the different kingdoms. And that's kingdoms are taxa. They are hierarchical levels of classifying organisms. So taxonomy is the branch of biology because you identify, naming, and classifying species. And use something called the Linnaean system. Nicholas Linnaeus, who I think lived in the 18th century, he set up this way of naming species, giving unique names to species, and setting up a hierarchical classification of species into broader groups of organisms. Hierarchical meaning groups of organisms that are more and more look more and more similar and more closely related. Of course, he wouldn't think they were related to each other because he was a creationist. This is long before evolution was even thought of when he set up this system. It's also called binomial nomenclature. It's a two-part Latinized name. And this is important for giving organisms unique names. Now sometimes when we do ID in organisms, like we're doing a tree ID, we use common names. But the thing is, common names can differ from one part of the world and even one part of the country to a different part. And so I always give the example of in Florida, you might have a problem with palmetto bugs. Or if you're in Louisiana or Eastern Texas, you may have trouble with water bugs. But up here, if you come up to up here into New England, you'll have problems with American cockroaches. That's all the same organism: American cockroach, palmetto bug, water bug. Different parts of the country have different names. So in order to know what we're talking, so in order to go anywhere in the world and know exactly what organism we're talking about, we have to give organisms unique names. So that American cockroach is actually its scientific name is Perplaneta americana. The first part of the binomial is a genus. So it's Perplaneta is a genus of the American cockroach. And we'll take this example of a panther, and this genus is Panthera. The second part, and usually the genus is, not usually, it's always capitalized, all right? And then the second part of the binomial is used to distinguish species within a genus, and it's often called the specific epithet. And there's going to be a small group of closely related organisms in a genus, but it's going to be one of those that has a specific epithet. And that's always lowercase, and it's usually, if you see it in print, it's usually italicized or underlined. Okay, and genera have pretty much been established. Taxonomy is probably not going to find too many more genera, but they're going to find new species all the time. And if you find a new species and you describe it and you write a paper on it, and you set up a type specimen for it, you get to name it. You get to add the specific epithet. And you can name it after anything you want. It just has to be, you know, fake Latinized. So remember what the scientific name for human beings is: Homo sapiens, which is Latin for wise man. I don't know about that, but wise man. Now, and we are the only extant member of our genus. We're only human being that's still, any human being, any organism in the genus Homo is a human being. And it used to be, there were ancient members of the genus Homo, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo florensis. But there's only one left, and that's Homo sapiens. All the other members of our genus are extinct. Why? We're not sure. Neanderthal might be extinct because we made him extinct. We're not sure about that. Anyway, the two parts must be used together to name a species. Thus, the scientific name for the leopard is Panthera pardus. First letter of the genus is capitalized, and the whole binomial is italicized. So the Linnaean binomial solved the problem of the ambiguity of common names. Linnaeus also introduced a system for grouping species into a hierarchy of categories. Beyond the grouping of species in general, taxonomy extends to progressively broader categories of classifications. All right. So, so when we go from from the bottom of those listings, domains, kingdoms, phyla, classes, orders, family, genera, we go into more and more exclusive taxa. Exclusive means fewer and fewer organisms in each one of those levels. So there's a gigantic number of organisms in the kingdom Animalia, but there's a smaller number of organisms in the phyla Chordata, which is our phyla, or phyla Arthropoda, which is what insects and spiders and everything. And so we're going to look at these smaller and smaller classifications down to individual species. So in each taxa has certain characteristics, and they're artificial really, of all of these particular animals in this taxa have this certain thing in common. Like we say with the kingdoms, you know, what do all animals have in common? They're heterotropic, right? They don't have a cell wall, so they're multicellular. That's what all animals have in common. And then there are other characteristics that other taxa have in common, and they become more and more specific and fewer until you get down to a genera and then individual species in each genera. Each genus. Okay. So here we go. So we talked about the domains, eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. So the panther is in eukarya, and we are in eukarya. Right? They're also in the kingdom Animalia, the multicellular heterotrophs without cell wall, and we're still in there with them. So we still have that in common. We're in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. They are chordates. In one time during their embryonic development, they exhibited a notochord. So do we. Okay. Class mammalian. Now we're getting down into other more specific areas. So you know, other classes in kingdom in phylum Chordata could be reptiles and amphibians, for example, and the fish. So we're in class Mammalia, and that's based on mammillary glands. We feed our infants with mother's milk from mammillary glands, and so do panthers. But then we get down to the order, and there we change. Now we diverge from panthers. They are in order Carnivora, which means they're carnivores. Along with all the canine species, feline and canine species, cats and dogs. We are in an order called primates, along with the great apes, the New World monkeys, and Old World monkeys. They are, now there's a family, different series of big cats, you know. There's cheetahs and lions, and the panthers are in the family Felidae. In order carnivore, they're in family Felidae. And then in Felidae, as I said, there's probably lions and tigers and cheetahs are probably in there, and one for panthers. And then the genus is Panthera. So they're even diverse from lions and tigers, the genus Panthera. And then there's one particular member of the genus Panthera is the Panthera pardus. Okay. So this is a way to structure an understanding of the world. Remember, the criteria used to define these more inclusive groups, such as families, orders, and classes, they're arbitrary, really, but there's a way of making sense, and they are lead to a evolutionary relationship. I mean, before, back when Linnaeus was doing, he just wanted to put together organisms that seem similar. And if they're similar, they often have a close evolutionary relationship. They're often closely related, although not necessarily. And so we can make these trees of organisms that are more similar, look more similar to each other. And generally, they are the ones that are more closely related. So then we set up family trees of evolutionary relationships. So that's the next sentence. The first trees, classification trees, had nothing to do with evolutionary relationships because the people didn't even, evolution, the idea of evolution wasn't even put forth yet. Right. But now, we set up a classification system based on evolutionary relationships, an understanding of evolutionary relationships, and a comparing of DNA. And we're going to see that those trees made by comparing DNA, I think I mentioned this before in an earlier lecture, and the ones made by just looking at how similar organisms are, they match almost exactly. And so that's really strong evidence that all organisms are related to each other. And evolution has occurred on Earth. Okay, so explanation of the origin of diversity of life accepted by present-day biologists is the evolutionary theory proposed by Charles Darwin in his best-known book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, published on November 24th, 1859. Now, before this, the idea of fixed species, before this, thousands of years ago, Aristotle held the view that species were fixed, permanent forms and don't change over time. And it was a reasonable assumption because you don't see organisms changing like really quickly. I mean, every year, the same organisms are there, they look the same. Things don't really change all that much. There's an idea of a clockwork universe, that everything was fixed and nothing really changed. I mean, the stars were always in the same pattern and they revolved, and everything seemed to be in the heavens was the same, and the seasons came and went, and they were always similar. That's why in the ancient world, when you got a comet or something, that's when people really start to worry, because that's a change. Something is changing here. Or worse yet, a total solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse. They must have gone nuts. And now, of course, we know that everything changes. I mean, absolutely everything changes. Even the stars. We have a certain arrangement of stars in the sky right now. That's going to be different. In a few million years, that's going to be different. Those stars are moving with respect to Earth, and Earth is moving with respect to them. So um, they now know that everything changes. It just may change in a really slow way. That's not obvious. Okay. And then Judeo-Christian culture reinforces this idea with a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, which tells the story of each form of life being individually created in its present form. And so this is special creation. And some people still think that happened. And that's fine. That's fine. And even I would have students who are creationists. They don't agree with evolution. Now, I think I said this before in an earlier lecture. I don't. It's a inappropriate question to say, "Oh, do you believe in evolution?" Because you can't believe in evolution because it's not a belief system. It's based on evidence. The better thing to say is, do you agree with evolution? Do you agree that evolution happened? And a lot of people don't. It's like the only scientific theory that lots of people reject on religious grounds because it contradicts the Bible. I personally think it happened, and of course in this class, I don't care if you're creationists. You don't have to agree to evolution, but you need to know how evolution works, know what it is, and then disagree with it. All right. So I've had students do really well on an evolution exam, and then they say, I don't buy a word of this. Don't agree with a word of this, but this is how you're saying how evolution works. Okay. So in the 1600s, religious scholars estimate the age of Earth at 6,000 years. And it's mostly by a religious scholar by the name of Bishop Ussher. He went to the Bible, and there's one part of the book of Genesis that's really boring. Well, and that's the part all these got pages and pages of begats. This guy begat this guy begat these, begat. And what this guy did is he went back to all the begats and added them all together to go backwards in time to get to the first begat, and he came down with the time of creation on October 28th, I think it was, believe, 9:30 in the morning, 4004 BC. Okay, I guess maybe get to the year using those begats, but how we got to the day in October and the time, I don't know. That was going a little bit. Anyway, so most people back then, prior to Darwin and other scientists, thought the world was only a few thousand years old. Right? And that living species came into being relatively recently, unchanging in form, and it's dominated the intellectual climate of the Western world for centuries. But at the same time, naturalists were grappling with the interpretation of fossils. They started finding fossils, imprints of organisms that lived in the past, and they thought, this is really strange because, some of the fossils look just like the organisms that exist today, and it just and just died, a long time ago. But there were a lot of them that were really odd looking, and some that obviously don't exist anymore. And that really gave them a real problem. So fossils thought to be remains of living creatures, many were puzzling. The snake stone, which I'm going to show you in a moment, with the core bodies, they thought with the core body of the snakes, then why would none of it found an intact head? And could some fossils represent species that became extinct? And here's the thing that they didn't realize, the extinction. They didn't think extinction could happen because God is perfect, he made a perfect world, and his plan is have these organisms, and so, and they're here, and they should be here forever. So if they went extinct, well, something went wrong with God's plan then. Would God make a mistake because some organism went extinct? So there's a snake stone. It's actually a mollusk. All right, it has nothing to do with snakes. But maybe that is a present day organism, It just, we just haven't found it yet. But then they find these gigantic fossils, gigantic sea creature called ichthyosaur, fish lizard. Convinced many naturalists that extinctions had occurred because this was a huge thing, and it obviously doesn't exist anymore. So obviously it went extinct. So and there it is. And so why did it go extinct? How could God have made a mistake like this? So naturalists compared fossil forms of living species and noted patterns of similarities and differences, and some of them are really different. So they struggled with this, and then finally, there's one guy, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, the first heretic, the first guy who suggested that maybe organisms weren't specially created and put on Earth by God, but they came from other organisms, that they evolved from other organisms. So he's the first guy that said, that put forth the idea of evolution. So he explained evolution as a refinement of traits that equip organisms to perform successfully in the environment. His theory was called acquired characteristics. He proposed that by using or not using its body parts, an individual may develop certain traits that it passes on to its offspring. So, for example, why is a giraffe have a long neck? Because it's always stretching that neck. You're trying to find those upper leaves, and the strivings of parents somehow will put into eggs and sperm, and then those characteristics were found in the offspring. But that he didn't have any evidence for that, and it really is an unworkable thing. For example, I'm struggling to learn some French. Well, that means if acquired characteristics were correct, then my kids would know French when they were born. So he got it wrong. His idea he's famous, and he's notable for being the first guy to think about evolution. But a lot of people haven't heard of him because he got it wrong. It was mistaken. He's proposed that species evolve as a mode of interaction between organisms and the environment, helped to set the stage for Darwin. So Darwin knew about this guy, knew that his theory wasn't correct, but he got the idea from Lamarck. Okay. Charles Darwin, born more than 200 years ago. Really interesting trivia, on the same day as Abraham Lincoln. I think it was February 18th, 1897, something like that. Anyway, no, not 1897. I forget what year it was, but the same day as Abraham Lincoln. Fascinated with nature as a boy. And quit medical school because he found medicine boring and surgery before anesthesia horrifying. I mean, wow. Surgical techniques back in the 19th century. This was the greatest skill that a surgeon could exhibit was speed. Do it as quickly as possible because there's no anesthesia and the patient is in excruciating pain. Okay. So he studied to be a clergyman at Cambridge. Not surprising for a guy who was really interested in the natural world, because most of the naturalists back then were clergymen, because the natural world was God's creation, and looking at God's work if you study nature. But then at the age of 22, began a sea voyage on an HMS Beagle to help frame his theory of evolution. This guy named Captain Fitzroy, somehow now, Darwin was born into a privileged society. His grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, who was a really good scientist in his own right, and it was a privileged upper crust. Back in Victorian England, there was a real stratification of society. I mean, there was the upper crust, of high society, and wealthy people. And then there was the hoi polloi, all the really, really poor farm workers and indentured servants, and there was nobody in between. There was essentially no middle class. Okay. He was in the upper class. And Captain Fitzroy came to his father and suggested that he needed somebody on his, suggested how would he like to come along on his sea voyage that's going to go around the world and last like 5 years. Most people think it's because Fitzroy was looking for a naturalist. And that's not the case. He was not the naturalist on the Beagle. I don't know who the naturalist was. He acted like a naturalist. He wasn't. He was hired as the captain's companion. Not that kind of companion. Somebody who the captain could discuss things with, could eat dinner with, and could socialize with, because the captain is of upper crust of society, and then all the sailors are from the lower crust of society, and they don't interact. He just barks orders at these guys. But there must have been like a first officer and other officers that could. But anyway, so it's hired as the captain's companion. All right. There's a survey ship parting poorly known stretches of the South American coast. That's the first place it went, was across the ocean, went down the east coast of South America. So he spent his time on shore exploring the natural world, collecting thousands of specimens of fossils, living plants, and animals, keeping detailed journeys of his observations, and carefully noting the characteristics of plant and animals that made them well suited to diverse environments. So he was awestruck by going into the Amazon rainforest and seeing how many different types of organisms there are. I mean, diversity of life was just really something, because he knew probably like several hundred, maybe a couple thousand different species of organisms back in England, but this was like orders of magnitude more. And so that's when it's like getting the idea of where did all this stuff come from, So there it is. He went all the way down the east coast of South America, around Cape Horn, up the west coast, and then across about 600 miles out to the Galapagos Islands. And this is where we started getting some real ideas about evolution. That organisms weren't just put on the earth in the form that they are, that they change over time, and they change into whole different types of organisms. Now, he went also over here across to New Zealand, Australia, through the Indian Ocean, over the Cape of Good Hope, and then up on over South America, and finally back to England. And when he got back, he was so homesick for England that I don't think he ever left England again. Maybe he went to France once or twice, but he never left again. He stayed home. He married his first cousin. They lived in this big, expensive house, and he spent the next 20 years working on the stuff that he collected during that voyage around the world. And there's the Galapagos Islands, fascinating place. I visited them back, a long time ago, and he noticed things in there, such strange organisms that didn't exist anywhere else, but they had similarities to the South American organisms, but they were still really different. And each island had a different, like the tortoises. Each island had a tortoise that was like slightly different. And why would that be? So many of Darwin's observations indicate that geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms than similarity of environment. Um, and this was part of biogeography. Particularly in a desert, so there's the Atacama Desert in South America. There's the Kalahari Desert in South Africa, and then there's the Australian Desert, and they're all on the same latitude, and they're all very similar environments, but they have very different organisms that live in them. And Darwin's thinking, well, why? Why would there be such different organisms living in such similar environments? So geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships than similarity in environment. You can have this very, very similar environments and have very different organisms living in them. So yeah, but the plants and animals living in temperate regions of South America more closely resembled species living in tropical regions of that continent than species living in similar, and this is more biogeography. You think that the organisms living in a temperate area of South America would be similar to the ones in England that also live in a temperate area. So, you have a certain latitude south of the equator in South America, same latitude in North America, in the Northern Hemisphere, and very similar environments, very different organisms. So the organisms in a temperate environment look more similar to the organisms in like the tropical rainforest of South America than they do to the organisms that live in a temperate area in the Northern Hemisphere. So also the South American fossils Darwin found, though clearly examples of species different from living ones, were distinctly South American in their resemblance to contemporary plants and animals of that continent. So it was particularly intrigued by the geographic distribution of organisms in the Galapagos Islands. Young volcanic islands, about 900 kilometers or 540, I said 600, is around off the Pacific coast of South America. Most of the animals that inhabit these remote islands are found nowhere else in the world, but they resembled South American species. So these marine iguanas are really strange. These iguanas that are marine have flattened tails that aid in swimming, similar but distinct from the land-dwelling iguanas on the islands and on the South American mainland. It's similar, but behaving in a very different way. Also, each island, as I mentioned, has its own distinct variety of giant tortoises, unique inhabitants for which the islands were actually named. Galapagos means tortoise in Spanish. So the saddleback shells, dome cells, they're all different. Each island had really its own different type of tortoise. Now, and also there was they'll mention, I think they mentioned it maybe in the next chapter, Darwin's finches. He collected all these birds. And they did all kinds of different things. Some ate insects, some ate nectar, some ate large seeds, some ate small seeds. They did all kinds of different things. And he thought they were all really different types of birds. So he collected them, which means he killed them, and he brought them back with him. And he wasn't an ornithologist, so he couldn't really tell what type of bird what type of birds they were. On the mainland, you have flycatchers, sparrows, hummingbirds, birds of prey, all different kind of birds that do all kinds of different things, and they're all really different types of birds. But when he came back to England, he gave it to an ornithologist to try to tell me what type of bird are all these. The guy comes back and says, they're all finches. And a finch is a different type of bird, like a sparrow, a finch, a flycatcher, different types of birds. And on the mainland, they're usually birds that have big beaks and they eat big seeds. But these were all finches, he said, but they're all doing like really unfinch-like things, like eating, being a carnivore, or eating insects, or eating nectar or small seeds. finches generally do this. So what Darwin got the idea is, well, maybe some regular finches from the mainland of South America got blown off course, landed on this island where there weren't any birds, and they had all these ways of making a living and eating things that were not being utilized by any birds. What happened was called an adaptive radiation, relatively rapid evolution of one particular type of organism that starts doing different things because nobody else. It's the whole thing like nature abhors a vacuum. Here are all these insects that nobody's eating. So let's become an insect eater. We can eat all these insects and have it to ourselves, you know. So okay, so that was the a spark of that. Maybe things change in time, but one of the problems he had. So he started formulating this idea of natural selection, but he realized that it would be a really, really slow process. And if the Earth is only 6,000 years, doesn't seem like there'd be enough time into 6,000 years for this idea to work and create whole new different types of organisms. Okay, on that note, we're going to pick up on this slide and its new insights. We're going to talk about some of the books and papers that Darwin read from other people and gave him ideas about how his theory, this theory of natural selection that he was formulating, might have worked and is a real thing. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and so this will be let's call this 106 evolve 1. Okay, see you later.